I guess it's good to double check. So I think I am going to start. For me, I only see a black screen here in front of me, so I don't want to keep showing my camera on, but I just wanted to welcome everybody on behalf of ITS Canada and the ADIS Technical Committee, co-chaired by Judy Yu and Omar Chowdhury. My name is Janneke. I'm the Managing Director of ITS Canada. Is my slide moving to the next slide called ITS Canada Vision or not? No, it's not.
Judy, you're still on the or Janneke, you're still on the cover page there.
Okay, let's try. It's not moving. So I'm gonna go ahead and say, just wanted to talk a little bit more about ITS Canada. Our vision is that mobility technologies enable the safe, efficient, and reliable movement of goods and people. The hub is the place where the needs of the Canadian transportation system connect with the ideas, technologies, and capabilities of our members. ITS Canada is the hub where challenges meet solutions. Our mission: we support mobility technologies through championing benefits, fostering and promoting innovation, integrating the expertise, products, and services of our members, and enabling communication for learning and collaboration. And without any further ado, I'm going to stop showing my screen, and I'll hand the mic over to Judy and Omar.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you who are ITS Canada members, nice to have you. Those of you joining us maybe for the first time, welcome. Hope that you enjoy this webinar series. Today we have joining us from left turn, right turn, two of our speakers. First up is Kara Wilkie. Kara is the principal of LTRT's accessibility practice and is a seasoned disability rights advisor and policy analyst with experience in engaging with the disability community and organizations seeking to improve their accessibility. She is a consultant and legal counsel with over 19 years of experience, understanding legal obligations and various options for compliance. And Kara has advised multiple transit agencies, government, quasi-government, and private organizations about accessibility legal obligations, including Accessible Canada Act and the human rights legislation. She works with organizations to understand why accessibility is important and to chart a path to more accessible future. And so welcome, Kara. Thank you for taking time to present today. Second speaker, Yuval Grinspan. He's the principal of LTRT's public transit practice and has been working in the transportation sector since 2002. So been a long time. He started his career with IBI Group and helped establish a team focusing on supporting Canadian transit agencies to plan and implement ITS. So definitely a member of our community for a very long while. Yuval, in 2014, joined TTC and then gained firsthand experience working in the transit agency to deliver large-scale technology transformation programs. And in 2018, he left to focus on growing LTRT and to support organizations across the country on business strategy, service planning, accessibility, and technology projects. So both speakers, thank you so much for your time today, and take it away. I will be allowing you to share your screen, Kara, or yes, okay. It is over to you. Thanks so much.
I guess just before you do, Judy, I was just going to say, within the questions, while you all brings up the slide deck, if you have questions, please use the question tab on your on the interface and be able to submit your questions. And what we'll do is we'll ask those questions at the end. Thanks.
All right, is my screen sharing now? Fabulous. And just for the benefit of the audience and those that maybe can't see me, I am a middle-aged 45-year-old white male with, unfortunately, starting to thin my hair. I'm wearing glasses, I'm white, I'm wearing a sweater, and I'm in a nice plain office. And I'll let Kara introduce herself, and then I'll get started.
Yeah, hi, welcome everyone. Yuval, as he said, we'll get going. I'm Kara Wilkie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with it's probably now neck length brown hair, glasses, sitting in front of some plants, both real and artistic plants. And happy to get going. So I'll turn things back over to you, Yuval.
Great, thank you so much, Kara. And so, yeah, today we're very excited to be here and talking to you about a subject that is newer to me than it is to Kara. Kara's been an expert in the accessibility space for many years. My background is in transportation and specifically public transportation. But over the recent years, I've started to get more involved and specifically around the accessibility, the intersection between accessibility and transportation. And as some of you may know, I've been in the ITS realm for a while as well, and so understanding and growing to understand how we can make our systems, our technology systems, more accessible for the people that use them. And so we are here to present the first part of a two-part series webinar. This one we've titled "Your Systems Might Be Accessible," and then we put that asterisk, but they're probably not. And over the course of the session today, we'll explain why that is, but also why that's okay, and leading into the next session where we'll talk about what you can do about it. I'll share the Menti in a moment and how we plan to engage with you. But really the objectives of today's session, again, as it's two parts, the objectives of today's session is helping to redefine for you and expand your understanding of accessibility. We're going to spend and interact with you specifically on looking at and understanding what are the types of barriers that the public might engage with the traveler information systems and other ITS that we as transportation professionals might be responsible for either implementing or designing or procuring. We're going to touch on the importance and specifically what are the legislation and standards that exist in the market and what's their role and how should we view those. And sort of that'll be it for today, leading into the next session where we then focus more about what can you do with that and what can you as professionals do to improve the accessibility of your systems and what the value of that is to the community. So the agenda, very succinctly, we'll just do quick, we got our introductions. Judy sort of introduced us, so maybe we won't spend too long on that. We'll tell you a little bit about LTRT. We'll then talk about broadening that definition of disability and accessibility, talk about barriers in technology specifically, the legislation and standards piece, and then just wrap up with some thoughts and conclusions. So as was mentioned earlier, Kara and myself are both from a consulting firm called Left Turn, Right Turn. Kara is the principal. She leads the accessibility practice within LTRT, and I'm the principal and lead the transportation practice. We're a relatively young firm. We were incorporated in 2014 and have been growing steadily since. At this point, we have approximately 15 full-time staff and a broader team of about 40 that we work with on a variety of projects related to transportation and accessibility. Many of us do bring experience having worked on both sides of the table, both as consultants as well as within public entities and public agencies. And our team does bring very much cross-country experience as it relates to accessibility and transportation. We have staff based in central Canada and Manitoba, in the East Coast. Many of us are based here in Ontario, but our work itself is taking us across the country. We've worked with agencies pretty much coast to coast at this point, a variety of projects ranging from transportation as well as non-transportation in the accessibility space. And we do some work down in the US as well. With that, I'm going to ask everyone to pull out their smartphones, pull out your smartphone or open another window on your computer. For those of you that haven't used it, we are going to be using Menti at a couple junctures in our presentation today. So to start, what I want you to do is go to menti.com, type in that code, and the very first question is just, what organization are you representing from? We want to see who you are. We want to know who we're talking to. And so I'll give you a moment to share that. And I will put it up on here and you can get a sense of where your colleagues and where everyone is joining from. And so we see City of Toronto, Parsons, City of Ottawa, Fortran Traffic Systems, TTC, Associated Engineering, City of Calgary, ITS Canada. We'll give people a few more minutes. There's roughly 40 people here. And as far as I know, there's some overlap between organizations, but there's probably more than that. OC Transpo is represented, University of Windsor. And I do encourage everyone to join and participate. It will make this for a more engaging session. So I'm just going to let that number creep up. We're at roughly 23 respondents here. JD Irving, EXP, WDBA. I'm not sure what that one is. PBX Engineering, Innovative Traffic Solutions, GHD. This is great. All right, great, thank you. And so the next question that I'm just going to ask again, so we can learn a little bit about who you are, who the audience is, how confident, and it should update directly on you, on your end with Menti, how confident are you in thinking about accessibility in the work that you do? So we have various options here, ranging from you are an expert to you know nothing. And honestly, everything, there's no right answer. It's really just to give us a sense and to give you a sense of who the other participants are here. So we have a couple people that are experts. Maybe Kara is one of those. I'm not sure if she responded, but glad to hear there's a couple others. And then there's a bunch in that middle range that are quite familiar with it or feel that they have some basic knowledge. And then we have one person who is open to admitting that they know very little about this. And so thank you as well for that. Great, and so that's sort of, we wanted to just get a sense of who you are and also to make sure that everyone could get Menti working. Hopefully everyone to a certain extent is able to engage with the platform. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift into the first subject, part of our subject matter, which is we want to talk a little bit about disability and accessibility and sort of broaden people's understanding and appreciation for what that means. And so before I shift back to the PowerPoint and hand it over to Kara, the last question that we're going to put to the group in Menti for now, we'll come back to it again later, is when you think of disability, what do you think of? So what comes to mind when you think of the word disability? Again, there's no wrong answers. Your answers are not being recorded, or at least not directly attributable to you. So please be honest, share what comes to mind in your mind, when you hear that word, disability. So lots of entries popping up, accommodation, infrastructure, accessibility, barriers, physical disabilities, wheelchairs, visual impairments and blindness, the AODA, which is the Accessible Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which is the legislation here in Ontario around accessibility. Equity is popping up a few times, special needs, limited access, infrastructure, challenges, accommodations. You're welcome to put in multiple words here, multiple responses. Again, it's really just to get people's brains and people in the right headspace for this the next section. I'll give it another 20 seconds. Physical or cognitive came up. That's great. Human rights, physical, mental, design solutions, additional infrastructure. All right, so with that, what I'll do is I'm gonna turn it over to Kara. Kara Wilkie is, as I mentioned, is the principal and leads our accessibility practice at LTRT. And she's gonna talk to you a little bit, if I can get the slides up, there we go, about disability and accessibility.
And so I'm going to go through these slides more quickly just to get us through into the meat of the content. This is really to make sure that we're level set, that everybody has this common understanding of really what those pieces are that we're talking about. We have just giving some statistics, which is helpful for people who have not been thinking about this, to be able to give some mind and some thought to both how big this population is that we're talking about, but also depending on your need, they can also be useful around the business case that sometimes is necessary for pieces of accessibility. And so current statistics are about 6.2 million Canadians through Statistics Canada identify as having a disability based off of kind of how those are framed. It's 22% of the population. We also are generally estimating that it's about 1 in 3 Canadian seniors that have a disability. And that population is expected in the next 20 years to become 3 million Canadian seniors are forecasted to have a disability. And so that's, as our aging population and as life expectancies have increased, there's also a greater correlation with advanced age and disability. And so as both there's the aging population as well as greater life expectancies. And so that is expected to increase. Often these statistics are believed to be underreported because there's a number of disabilities that would actually meet a definition of disability, but also that impact people's experiences in society, but that they often would not complete a survey and identify it as having a disability. And one of the very common examples I give of that is color blindness. And we'll come back to this down the road, but it is one of those things that or people who say that they've got kind of some other physical ailments, people often don't talk about them as disabilities as well. So we've got just a definition on the next slide. Here it is, which there's many, many different definitions of disability, but I wanted to really make sure that we're thinking about this from the broadest possible perspective. And so that definition is often used as any impairment in a person's body or mind that causes them to encounter barriers in society that people without those impairments don't encounter. So I'll come back to this around kind of the location of that barrier being, or that disability being within the body or within society, but it includes all of those different things that people were typing in to the Mentimeter. So physical disabilities, those often we think about people who are using a wheelchair or might have some difficulty walking, but it also includes people who might have arthritis and so might have some limited dexterity in their finger use or their arm movement, for example. It also includes mental disabilities, so there's people with mental illness, as well as intellectual disabilities. And so Down syndrome is one of those examples. Obviously, there's many others. Cognitive disabilities is sometimes also referred to as neurodivergence. You would have heard that terminology in this space. It's used a lot now. And so that being people with autism or people who might have ADHD, just as examples. Learning disabilities is another really key example. Often those really impact people's engagement with text, with images, and their processing of information. So here we've given dyslexia as one of those examples. Communication barriers, and so there is some overlap between these. So communication barriers, here we're giving the example of a speech impairment, so potentially a stutter. You may also have the example of people with a physical disability, so cerebral palsy, for example, that also may impact speech, or somebody who is deaf and that also impacting their communication preferences as well. And then we've got the last kind of category on here is sensory, which is hearing impairments as an example, people who are deaf, vision impairments, color blindness, and there's a lot of overlap between those different categories. I think maybe just the last thing is that these things all exist on spectrums of kind of lower level, like more minor impairments to more impactful impairments. They also can be kind of temporary or permanent, and as I've been saying, can be categories that merge in people's experiences of them. But as we're talking about those disabilities, there's also kind of the barriers that people are experiencing in society, which was part of that definition. And in that, a barrier is anything that's preventing people from the full and equal participation in society as a person with a disability. And so just to give you some of those examples, I'm deliberately not using transportation examples, particularly because we're going to come back to those in a moment, but they can be physical and architectural. There's a lot of overlap between those, but we think about those as a building without a ramp or a building without an elevator. But it can also be that a light switch is too high, or that other things are, I give the example, sometimes there's a photocopier that isn't accessible. It's too high for somebody to be, who either is of short stature or is using a wheelchair to be able to access. They can be technological barriers, and so obviously this is very related to the work that people are doing on this, that came to this webinar. And one of those examples is websites that have not been designed to be accessible or to work well with people who are using screen readers. And that's true whether it's a website or whether it's an application or many other pieces of technology. If they aren't kind of programmed in the back end and the front user-facing piece of that in a way to interact well with the adaptive technology that people use. So people, for example, people who are blind might use technology that reads the screen to them. And so technology or a website where things are not properly programmed in the back end of them will be very difficult for them to use. But they could also be things in the technology that aren't just the programming of them, but also the presentation of information. So in this way, there's lots of overlap between those barriers, and often very good, just good communications practices, good web or app design practices, and user experience more broadly. Is that the more kind of logically and clearly organized information is, the more that you're removing kind of unnecessary information. All of those pieces will make things more accessible, or here in the flip side of the barrier, less accessible if they're not there. There's attitudinal barriers, which are going to be a little bit less relevant to the technological work. It comes up a lot in kind of both employment and human resources, and kind of customer experience or customer facing work, where those biases and stigmas that we carry around unconsciously influence how we perceive the people around us, and then for how we treat them. Communications, both what communications mechanisms are offered. So if only telephone auditory methods of communication are offered, videos that have no captions for people who are deaf, or videos that don't have transcripts. Transcripts are really useful for people with learning disabilities, or a video that doesn't have a visual description. So there's many videos that teach someone how to do something and don't have any auditory explanation of that, which then would not be something accessible to somebody who can't see the video. And then there's lots of barriers that exist from a policy. Here we're giving an example of a rule that prevents animals. Obviously that's against the law across Canada, but it's certainly an example of something that would exclude people with disabilities who are using service animals. Accessibility as the flip side to those barriers, and just we can view this as a process of striving for continuous improvement. We can review it as a spectrum, so things can be more accessible or things can be less accessible. So going back to the kind of website technology example as I was giving a moment ago, there are certainly things that will technically work with a screen reader, but not work well and not work smoothly or be cumbersome. And so there, are certainly spectrums of accessibility. And then we can also think of it as an ideal end state. And so there's legislation in many, many provinces across the country that are focused on requiring accessibility. And so the Accessible Canada Act is a fully accessible Canada by 2040. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, I think it was 2025, if I'm not mistaken, as an ideal end state that we're moving towards in the future. The last slide that I'm just going to talk about before I turn things back over to Yuval to get us right into this in the ITS context is just to think about there's different models of disability. And so if you're in this work or had these conversations before, you've certainly heard these. Historically, we were really talking about the medical model of disability. So really a focus on diagnosis, a focus on the individual being kind of the problem. They need to be treated, cured, they need to adapt. And have then more in the last maybe 20 years or 30 years been moving more into this social model of disability, which has been relocating where is the disability, where is the problem, to not within the person that has a disability, but that the problem is the world around them. And so a lot of the, I was really excited to see that a lot of the comments in the Mentimeter were located or talking about inclusion and talking about the need to focus on making those changes and those improvements. And so this is really about society changing and society adapting rather than focusing on the problem being within the individual. So I'm going to turn things back over to Yuval to kind of walk us through some of these examples, and we'll go back to the Mentimeter as well. And we'll talk about this in the context of ITS. We will come back to us speaking, but right now we'll, I think, bring things to be more engaging. Back to you, Yuval.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think one of the thoughts as we were preparing for this webinar and you know, when trying to help people broaden their appreciation and sort of how to bring the accessibility into their work more effectively, it's, you know, we didn't want to just be a pair of talking heads. And really, when it comes to, you know, starting to think about this topic more comprehensively, it's really a matter of engaging with specific use cases and thinking through, okay, what are the barriers that the choices that we make as professionals will take place. And so we purposely wanted this part here, this barriers in ITS conversation, to start with and really be focused around putting you folks to work. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to share with you, we're going to do a series of a few of these, depending on how long it takes. I'm going to put some transportation technology or ITS component in front of you. And I just want people to drop notes in Mentimeter about what barriers. So now we're saying, what barriers do you see in this implementation? And it's not to criticize. It's not to say, oh, how this agency or this particular technology isn't good. It's more from the view of starting to broaden our appreciation. And quite frankly, our society's appreciation of barriers and accessibility has evolved. And what we, you know, the traditional, the view of, okay, we only need to worry about ramps at buildings has evolved to much more than that. And certainly with the same is true with technology and how we implement technology. And so the first thing is just really being able to look at previous examples of implementations and say, okay, well, what are the things that we see now that, you know, I'm sure the people that were responsible for implementing these at the time spent some time thinking about potential barriers and sort of how to make them accessible. But what do we see now that maybe was missed? So yeah, there's already a few on here, which is great. The height of the parking meter is a problem. Yeah, there's people that use wheelchairs that drive. There's cars that support wheelchair use. And so someone in a wheelchair or in a mobility device that maybe drove wouldn't be able to access that easily. The height of the buttons on the meter, no auditory interface, that's great. This is, oh, it's scrolling down, great. The screen of the meter is too small, the text size on the sign may be far from accessibility parking, good. Yeah, the height is again on there, the size. No braille labels to the buttons. That's an interesting one, and it's one that we talked about even internally, because at its surface you'd think, well, okay, but someone driving needs to presumably can see, right? And so why would they need braille? However, who says it's the person driving that's paying, right? Maybe it's the passenger. And so yeah, maybe they're blind and they're the ones that are paying. So yeah, no braille is a great observation there. Machine is too high, no braille, no multilingual option, a readout. operate. So I'm seeing sort of the same. Kara, is there any others that you wanted to identify? Any others that you can think of?
Yeah, I think there's some dexterity that's required to put in a card and take out that card and turn that little green button, all of which require fine motor skills and a level of dexterity that may not be possible. Not just the height of it, but also kind of how you can't see, but I'm curious, some people have motorized chairs that actually enable that person to get up higher, but I'm also curious kind of what is the kick space, what is the foot space around the footprint of that? How close can somebody get in a motorized chair to that in order to be able to actually access that? Many of these have very low contrast in the, especially on the screen between the medium gray background and the black text, which both is difficult for many people when the sun is shining in the wrong direction very brightly, but also for some visual impairments where you have sight, but the color contrast may actually be more problematic. And just the length of that text certainly makes me wonder how, I know I have mistakenly overpaid or underpaid for parking. And so how easy is that for somebody to be able to process and understand quickly what their needs are?
Whoops, sorry, it just reverted back to the PowerPoint. All right, let's move on to the next example here. So that one was a parking pane display. Here we have ticket purchasing for public transportation. An example
In
of a
Italy, we all dream
EVN.
of being
One is in Italy, yeah, it looks for like a nice for a train station in Italy. So what barriers do you see here? Yeah, the height, again, is an issue for sure. No foot space, yes. Yeah, so someone approaching from the front in a mobility device or a chair would not necessarily be able to get too close. Good. Yeah, I like someone starting to think about dexterity requirements for sure. Yeah, headphones for auditory feedback. Yes, the screen is tilted as is only for people who stand. That's right. So it's basically assuming that someone is looking at it from above. Exactly. Again, no braille on this one, which is always a challenge with electronic displays for sure. Kara, any others you want to call out while we're on this and to keep things moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell, but so somebody's given the example of the ability to use headphones, and is there an auditory output? So both to announce what's on the screen. So Braille is honestly, because of technology, is being used less and less, but the auditory output and the tactile indicators to know how to get that. But also, is it only auditory? Is there I can't tell, but sometimes these have the ability to push a button for assistance, and then it's only an auditory support rather than the ability. So if somebody was deaf and needing to buy train tickets, the ability to engage in that in a sighted or visual way. I also just want to say that the height of that is not just for people who use wheelchairs, it's also something around people of short stature, people with limited arm movement, all of which can affect their ability to utilize something that is much higher. And then of course, there are lots of places that there's overlap. If this is only accepting credit card, I can't tell if you can put coins or money and dollars into that, but things that only accept credit cards, there's also some overlap between that and other equity deserving groups around the co-occurrence of disability and poverty and what that means around the ability to pay for things that require credit cards.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next one.
So one other thing I'd say about many of these things is also just the ability to find them. Is finding this, knowing like if somebody's coming in without sight, even if the whole machine is actually accessible, how can they actually even locate it within the train station?
So wayfinding, yeah. Okay. All right, here we have a large panel touchscreen traveler information display. So yeah, definitely need to keep in mind the color contrast. Yeah, is it designed for taller people? The contrast of the text, the font size people are calling out. I think the other thing to note, and maybe Carrie, you can feel free to expand on it, but is the dexterity required to maneuver, to manage a touch screen.
Yeah, and again, yeah, the ability to find it, the ability to use it, it's all visually presented information. There's no auditory alternative to this information. I think maps in particular also are going to have some challenges for people with some of the cognitive or divergence around the ability to process that information and understand its significance. There will also, I think there's also a question about the information that is in this system. Is it actually reflective? So if it was giving you a route of travel, is it giving you an accessible route of travel? Who is it assuming that is traveling? Or, you know, there was an app in Toronto recently about public washrooms that were accessible for people with disabilities, to be able to not just find public washrooms, but to know what accessibility features they had. So not just the technology, but what the information that's within the technology.
And that maybe is tied to the, when you talked earlier about the types of barriers, you mentioned attitudinal being one of them, and it can be unconscious bias, and you know, if someone, you know, that doesn't necessarily have a disability is designing the system, they might be thinking about all of the interface, the accessibility features they need to build into the interface, but then they don't necessarily think about the data that's being loaded and then the content that's being loaded, and how to make that accessible to, or what information would be of most importance to different types of users. So
yeah, and a good example of that is, like, even if there, so, you know, in many municipalities, you can rely more clearly now on curb cuts. But if there's a path of travel that has kind of auditory signals or does not, or if there's construction, that, you know, all that's really important information to be conveying to people about travel. While construction can affect many people's ability to walk around the neighborhood, for people with disabilities who use wheelchairs, who use service animals, many of those things can make it much more difficult to travel and need an alternative path.
So I'm going to do one more, this one here, which unfortunately it got truncated, but it's basically your traditional highway sign, electronic display.
It's just missing the French on the other side, is what the truncated version of this is.
Visual only. And we actually put it in here kind of as a trick question. And it's sort of evident by the fact that people are not putting answers in, because this is actually a quite well designed, accessible feature. And you know, Kara, when we were talking about it internally, and maybe I'll hand it over to you to discuss, it's like, I think it's one of those things where the alignment between what benefits an individual with specific accessibility requirements aligns with the benefit of the general public. So maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so somebody has found one. So all caps is more difficult to read. Dyslexia, for dyslexia accessibility, you would generally want to use sentence case. So that is a very good example. Great catch, person who wrote that. But we can assume that a driver has sight, because that is a legal requirement. And so as this is information directly aimed at the driver, not aimed at the passenger, it's fair that it's visually communicated information. It's not fair to assume that everybody who's driving, you know, has hearing, it doesn't use a wheelchair, right? Those are not accurate assumptions. But here there is alignment, because in order for information to be communicated well on a sign to people who are driving quickly on the highway, and there might be, you know, kind of environmental barriers to being able to see that information, the color contrast is good, the information is quickly and clearly communicated, both in text and visually. There's no extra information, it's very succinct. And it's, as I said, the color contrast is really good.
All right, so maybe with that, Kara, I'll flip it back to the summation here, and I'll hand it back to you and go through the final slides.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk about some of the other kinds of barriers in technology, some of which don't lend themselves to giving you visual examples as well. And so for physical disabilities, these are for many kind of desktop or mobile applications, websites, thinking about barriers can be about if it requires a mouse or if it requires two hands. So any of those kind of click and drag functions, hovering functions, are going to be things that people who don't use for accessibility reasons, don't use that technology, would experience barriers. Similarly, dexterity, I was giving you the example of, but if you have to hover in order for an interface to activate or even to be visual, if it's a very small hover area or a very small button, it requires a dexterity, even if somebody's using a mouse, to actually be able to keep their hand still to be able to use that. Similarly, there can be time-based media or timeouts. So that might be like time-based media can mean videos or other things which you don't have the ability to slow down or speed up. They can be carousel images that are moving forward on a website that somebody doesn't have the ability to pause, or timeout. So how quickly do you have to complete something? How quickly does that button disappear after you've kind of hovered over or activated it? Kind of sensory, so information that's only communicated through colors. We see this a lot in my work trying to come up with a method of developing a Gantt chart, a schedule, any other kind of charts that don't rely on colors. So we're relying on red and green to indicate that things are good and bad, or the lack of color contrast as we were going through in those other examples. Things that are auditory signals alone or are not adjustable. So I'm familiar, again, I said I'm in Toronto, but I'm familiar with some of the payment systems that both change color and make an auditory input after you've either successfully or unsuccessfully used them. So the lack of that, if you're only relying on the auditory or only the visual, you're missing some people. And then, of course, the user interface design that we've been talking about. So on technology, there's pieces about if headings are properly programmed as headings, if buttons are properly labeled as buttons in the back end of those systems to enable somebody who's using adaptive technology to understand what those are. And similarly, captions or audio descriptions, if you're doing videos, particularly if they're, I would say, especially if they're instructional videos, the audio description, it's actually a matter of if you're doing an instructional video, the instructions needing to also meet how somebody is using the technology. So describing a image, if it's an instructional video, is not going to be very useful for somebody who's not using the image, but rather is tabbing on their keyboard through to the appropriate button. Around intellectual disabilities, there's the clarity and organization of information. If there's excessive information, if things aren't written in plain language, the fonts, so both serif fonts, the size, italics. And similarly, people with intellectual disabilities will also sometimes use text to speech to either, they might use it to dictate, but they also might use it to have their screen read to them as a better way of processing that information. Also around speech input. So one of the examples that we didn't use was if the only way of getting assistance is through speech. So not only the ability to hear, but if somebody has a speech impairment that prevents them from communicating back, they might be able to actually understand the instructions, but aren't able to express their need for support. And then excessive sensory input, so rotating images, sound, animations, all of those things if they're unnecessary. So at the beginning, I was actually finding that with the Metimeter, it keeps switching in that first visual through the word cloud, can create barriers for some people with cognitive disabilities. So I'm going to talk briefly, maybe I'll do this in the next 5 minutes, I'm just aware of time. We're going to talk about the legislation and standards that exist across the country and that are coming out further across the country. Accessibility should never be just because of legislation and standards, but they are also the way of, in some organizations or some individuals, to kickstart the conversation by being required to think about accessibility. So if you can keep going. we were historically relying on human rights as the main method of advancing accessibility for people with disabilities and for other equity deserving groups. But with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then first the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act in Canada, there's been a shift to not only relying on human rights, but also relying on standards as being a more proactive way of moving towards accessibility, rather than the individual kind of reactive way of doing that through the human rights legislation. Just in the interest of time, I think I'll keep going. So under human rights, people have had, the tribunals and courts had a very broad definition of disability and very broad requirements, but because they were really focused on the individual, they were very ineffective at addressing systemic barriers, particularly those related to technology. And so while they have their place, very rarely would you have seen, at least in Canada, with our less litigious or less effective litigious legal system, human rights being a very effective mechanism of driving change, driving greater accessibility. So there's been a shift towards standards, as I said. Right now, we are seeing the expansion of accessibility standards legislation across the country. So in addition to the Accessible Canada Act, which we did not color the entire country on this map, we also currently have legislation in BC. We have the Accessible British Columbia Act, there's the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. There's some legislation in Quebec that's slightly less specific than the others, but it is kind of more in this category. There's legislation, the Accessibility Act in Newfoundland and Labrador. There's legislation in Nova Scotia Accessibility Act. And then there's 3 that are currently being explored by the government. So in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick. So if you are in one of the 4 remaining jurisdictions that don't currently have it, it's coming. And we have it nearly everywhere else. Almost all of that legislation, when they come to technology, they are building off of WCAG, which are international guidelines on website accessibility, which is WCAG stands for Website Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so this is true both that most of these legislations in Canada, the US, and Europe have been built off of WCAG and kind of expanded upon it or changed it. And WCAG is based off of these 4 principles, the POUR principles. We'll get into this in more detail at the second round, second part of this webinar series, but just wanted to kind of give you a base sense of what are those main elements of what is accessible technology. WCAG is intended for websites, but it's really useful for technology more broadly. And that's to make it that it's perceivable, that people are able to see, understand, experience the information that's there, the functions that are there, that it's operable, that somebody can use it from a keyboard and without, that you have enough time to read, that helps users navigate and understand the content, that it's understandable, that the text is readable and understandable, it appears in and operates in predictable ways, and it avoids and corrects mistakes. So that's examples of like forms or other things that are, and it's really good examples of where there's a lot of overlap with user experience and user design. And then the robust just being about maximizing the compatibility with future tools. So adaptive technology, as with all technology, is increasing in what it offers people with disabilities. And so by being robust, allowing there to be its usability with future tools. Well, I think you can continue. So we have other standards in the US and under the European Union. Right now, under the Accessible Canada Act, there is a standards development committee that has been tasked with trying to adopt the European standards in their entirety. Both of these standards are built off of WCAG, but they actually apply to technology more broadly than websites. They are intended to be on information and communications technology much more broadly. So in the US, there's Section 508 standards that are applicable to federal agencies, and in some regards, organizations that are funded or contracted through those federal agencies, because those obligations are being passed down through contracts. And so those require that these things, when being that technology is developed, procured, maintained, and used in a way that is accessible, And it applies on documents, websites, hardware, software, and authoring tools. So it is a very broad application in the sectors that it addresses. The European standards are very similar to the US standards. They're not identical, but both of them, as I said, incorporate WCAG. And so these are for public procurements of products and services in the European Union, and they apply to products, services, websites, mobile applications, and broadly to telecommunications. So we're seeing the increasing application of all of these kinds of standards in Canada as well. So the AODA has required WCAG compliance. There's currently some draft requirements coming out in Manitoba as well. And so, as I said, Canada is working towards the adoption of that European Union standard. It currently does require WCAG compliance for government websites, and is requiring, there's also some standards in development around procurement. And as I said, Ontario, as the first of the accessibility standards legislation in Canada, also has standards that require WCAG compliant, have standards that apply to self-serve kiosks more broadly, and is in the midst of considering recommendations to expand the current WCAG compliance requirements to include mobile applications, interfaces, and other technologies. And there was another recommendation for changes in Ontario to move from this kind of checklist WCAG method to things that are about functional accessibility requirements. So just thinking more, it's more focused on the needs of the end user rather than kind of a checklist of requirements, which is kind of more what WCAG looks like. And Oscar will get into both of those pieces a bit more in the second part of this webinar series. And then, as I said, Manitoba is currently starting to require WCAG compliance for government, public, and others in the upcoming years, and uses a slightly broader definition of website than we currently have in Manitoba, because it is also software applications that you run on a web server and that are used through a web browser. And then we don't have standards in other provinces, but we anticipate that they're coming because that's kind of the vision of this legislation.
All right, so now what? We have a few minutes left. We just want to wrap up some key takeaways, but really, you know, we know we've thrown a lot at you over the past 50 minutes, and I think what we want you to appreciate is that society's understanding of accessibility has dramatically evolved over the years. Kara's talked about the changing models of accessibility, our appreciation of barriers as well. And really, if there's something to know, is that, you know, some ITS will have more, some technologies will have less, but really barriers will exist in all technologies, and that's just a reality, and that's to a certain extent expected. But really, if you haven't designed with accessibility in mind, you don't accidentally become accessible. So the technologies, the systems that we as professionals are bringing to the fore and implementing will have more barriers if we're not purposely thinking about accessibility. So accessibility is a good practice, but it's also an evolving legal requirement. And so therefore, and sort of touching on what Kara talked about earlier on in defining it, it's a process. It's more of a journey. And it's something that as an organization and the organizations that we represent, we need to be continuously thinking about and bringing into the work that we do. And so that's our plug for the next session. So your systems aren't accessible. What can you do about that? What can you as an organization do to instill better processes, better knowledge, better change management, and better procurements and all of that to minimize the barriers that our future systems or our current systems have? And so that sort of brings us to a close in terms of where we wanted to get to today. I know there's only a handful of minutes left. We're happy to try to field a few questions, but the alternative also, if you aren't able to get your question in today, you can always email us the question, and we're happy to fold it into the next webinar, into the next presentation.
That was great. Thanks, guys. I'm just going to chime in here really quickly and encourage everyone to attend the second part of this webinar series, and to encourage others who think might benefit from this follow-up information. The recorded session, I believe, will be available through ITS Canada, and Yannicka will provide you with that link. So if they were unable to attend and wish to see this so that they can make most of the second part, that would be lovely. Second reminder is that you may not have received a Outlook reminder, calendar reminder when you registered for the first webinar that includes the second one. So mark it on your calendar for April 6th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, Daylight Time, and we'll be sure to see you there. I'll let Omar take a couple minutes to wrap up, and just want to say thanks to Yannicka, ITS Canada, thank to Kara, thank you to you all. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Judy. Yeah, we don't have any specific questions. We've got some comments. Great presentation. Thanks so much. I know just from the City of Ottawa perspective, for example, we currently have what we call our Accessibility Advisory Committee, and it's a group of 10 individuals with different lived experiences. Some of them are I think two of them must be at least over 60, so that we have a senior representation and so forth. And generally, a lot of the stuff that we do within transportation, for sure, as well as other sort of uses, we actually go and present to that committee to get some feedback and commentary and so forth. And I know that, for example, we here in the City of Ottawa started with some e-scooters. Certainly the initial things, e-scooters, there's concerns about how they're left, where they're parked and so forth. And as a part of that sort of engagement with the AAC, we've actually this past year, we required all the scooters to make a sound. And so I know that a lot of the new technologies are out there, electric vehicles are coming that don't necessarily currently make a sound, but they're actually legislation that requires them through Transport Canada for a acoustic vehicle alerting system to make a sound. And I know that actually our OC Transpo, which is our transit provider here in the city, is testing out a couple of electric buses and actually required that the buses actually provide a sound. So, you know, there's that sort of engagement. I just wanted to maybe ask just quickly, what are you seeing in terms of some of your other work in other jurisdictions on how much of an engagement before things are rolled out, as things are rolled out, or sort of is it after the fact? And then, you know, we'll look forward to the next presentation to talk a lot more in detail about how to actually make sure that our systems are accessible and get into that. So.
Well, I'm sure you've all has thoughts about how other people are engaging with their committees, but it's much better to get that feedback early and get it often than it is to be having those problems down the road and me trying to fix them. Once that technology has been deployed, it's so much more difficult or nearly impossible to kind of make those changes. So you really want to be kind of doing that as often and as early as possible, and doing that in a, you know, by having some rigorous relationships that you're able, some really good quality relationships where you're going to get good quality feedback from a diverse set of perspectives. Yuval, do you have other things to add to that?
Yeah, two things, and I echo the piece about, you know, getting the input early and putting it into your design, into your specs is a lot more painless than trying to deal with it after the fact. I think Kara sort of briefly mentioned it at the end there, but making sure that it's a diverse set of viewpoints is really key. Making sure that, you know, individuals that have different forms, experiences, different barriers, that they have their voices heard, so that you're getting and making sure that you're sort of accounting for the varying experiences that people might have. And then I would say the other benefit of the early engagement and the frequent engagement is that individuals with accessibility needs can also become great allies and champions. And you know, when I was at the TTC, we definitely experienced that with some very early engagement and some quite frequent engagement with the accessibility advisory team that they had. They became our biggest champions and helped push through things that politicians and others were a little bit more reluctant, but they were less reluctant to do it to the community than they would be to staff, right? So there's the benefit that can bring as well.
That's perfect. I think that's a great place to end. You know, engagement is important. inclusivity. You know, a lot of organizations are currently working through their diversity and equity and inclusion sort of programs and so forth. And I think that just sort of makes us all sort of a better place to live and a more enjoyable place for everybody. So I wanted to thank both you, Cara, and you, Val, for today's presentation. And just as Julie and mentioned, take today's meeting invite for today's session, make a copy of it, and move it to April. Let me just check. April 6th, Thursday, April 6th at 12 p.m. East Coast time. And that second webinar will explore how you as an organization or an ITS professional can do what you can do to improve the accessibility of your systems. We'll explore aspects of universal design, needs capture, and user testing. And we'll specifically talk about the procurement process as a key opportunity to enable and plan for accessibility. We'll discuss some potential standards and best practices that can be considered. And finally, we'll cover the importance of organizational culture change so that so as to continuously improve and make sure that as our society seeks to understand accessibility better, your approach to implementing ITS will as well. So with that, we ran a couple minutes over, but thanks so much to everybody for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday, April 6th.
Before I go, thank you, Omar and Judy, for organizing today's webinar, and then also the second one. And thirdly, don't forget to join us at the upcoming ITS Canada UBC Technology Innovation Forum in person, March 28th, March 29th. Details on the ITS Canada website. And there are some questions that were unanswered. I'll pull those out, send them over to Yuval and Cara with the CC to Omar and Judy so they can get back in a timely manner to those supposed questions. Thanks, everybody. Wherever you are, be safe, and we look forward to seeing you on April 6th. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.